And welcome to Broadband Breakfast Live Online for Wednesday, August 16th, 2023. I'm Drew Clark, editor and publisher of Broadband Breakfast. Happy to welcome all of you to a special Go Back to School edition of Broadband Breakfast Live Online. We're going to be talking today about remote education online learning, which is something we've talked about before. But before I do that, I just want to kind of give a lay out what's happening in the next couple of weeks, because even though it's August, even though we're in Washington in August, normally dog days of summer, right? Preparations for school, the new year, all that. It's a very busy month. I don't know quite how this August became so busy. Last week, I was out at Mountain Connect, our program, of course. Our live online program last month was a show featuring people at that broadband conference in Denver. Next week, I'll be in Florida, boy, joy, oh joy, Florida in August for Fiber Connect, which is another very, very significant show for our industry, fiber infrastructure. And then the week following, August 30th, we're going to be talking about Build America, Buy America, which again, I know many in this community have been following extremely closely because of its impact on the broadband equity access and deployment program of the infrastructure bill that, again, many of us are following extremely closely. I don't want to ignore or let you forget that we are coming up on the BEAD Implementation Summit. That's, of course, the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, and this BEAD Implementation Summit, which is going to take place in person here in Washington at Clyde's of Gallery Place on Thursday, September 21st. You have a little less than a week to get your early bird rates, $145 to attend this all-day event. Includes breakfast and lunch at Clyde's of Gallery Place. We've done many events there before. I hope many of you have been to or will go to, and we'll likely do many events in the future. But it's going to be a great discussion. We are going to drill into the details of BEAD implementation with state broadband officers, with review of previous broadband projects and programs, discussion about funding and the match funding, and in a town hall session on some of the problems and issues that BEAD applicants and potential awardees are dealing with. So don't miss that. It's really literally all over the site at Broadband Breakfast or broadbandbreakfast.com/BIS for BEAD Implementation Summit. You can find all about the program, and more details will be rolling out soon. We're going to roll out more details about particular panels, keynotes, and others. But I just wanted to, again, call your attention to that because we're really looking forward to that next month. All right. Let's also thank our sponsors, because we would not be able to do this free programming every Wednesday that we do without the support of our sponsors. They include Utopia Fiber, Broadband.Money, Comcast, DCS Technologies, Nokia, BroadbandToolkit.com, the ComLog Group, Google Fiber, Broadband Now, Michael Baker International, Bitstream Communications, and Positron Access. Thank you to our sponsors for your support, your continuing support of our programs here at Broadband Breakfast. With that, let's go ahead and open it up to our panel. Our esteemed panel will really bring this issue home. And what I started to say earlier, let me finish, which is that we've been doing Broadband Breakfast Live Online for almost 3.5. We're coming up on 3.5 years. And the very first episode we do, I remember the date for reasons that will surprise no one. It was March 13th, Friday the 13th, 2020. And that, of course, is the day America shut down, right? I mean, we literally shut down over the course of 24, 48 hours. So many activities came to an end. Everyone kind of went back home or did something. It was a confusing time, right? And what we did in creating this show at that time was a way to keep us connected, was to keep this community connected, because conferences came to a stop. Obviously, education, at least in-person education, came to a stop, and we had to adjust to the reality of life online. And so we said one of our guests here, Charles Severance, was on that program with us. We had him back a year later to talk about, how things were going in the pandemic. And here he is again as we do a follow-up edition on remote education, online learning. And in the framing for this discussion, we did lay out how the COVID-19 pandemic really has turned the world upside down, but also ushered in a transformative era of education, wherein online learning has emerged as a powerful alternative avenue. And this I know because, interacting with many of my family members, my brother-in-law is a professor. His life has changed and it has not gone back. He does not have the same level of interaction in person because of online learning and the tools associated with it. Here today, we're going to talk about both K-12 and higher education, and we will be hearing from each of our panelists. We're going to start with Jason Amos. Jason is the Director of Communications for the National School Boards Association, and he has more than 2 decades of experience in education policy and communications, including working as a congressional staffer and as the Director of Communications for National School Boards Association, which is a nonprofit organization representing state associations of school boards and member school districts. This organization's purpose is to ensure each student everywhere has access to excellent and equitable public education. So want to hear about that. Want to hear how that's working out in your perspective, Jason. And let me go ahead and introduce all the panelists, and then we'll go right to you, Jason. After Jason, we're going to hear from Eileen Bellistock. Eileen is the CEO of Bellistock Consulting and an EdTech leadership specialist within the Massachusetts Office of EdTech. So she is a former K-12 CTO and has championed safety, security, while also encouraging student agency and supporting students with equitable access to their education. So really look forward to your thoughts, Eileen, kind of more now on the outside, but as a consultant, still working closely with school boards and school agencies on what are the issues in the K-12 space for education. I already tipped off a little bit about Dr. Charles Severance. He's a clinical professor and teaches in the School of Information at University of Michigan, and he teaches over popular MOOCs or MOOCs, massively open online courses, including Python for Everyone, as well as many other courses on Coursera, edX, Future Learn, and he's a longtime advocate of open source education and learning. So Charles, we're so glad to have you back. Give us the higher education take on online learning. And then batting cleanup, last but not least, his last minute addition to our panel is Eric Langner. He's the CEO of the Information Equity Initiative, which is really interesting. And I urge you to give your ears to what he's going to say to us. It's a kind of a technology that it's a nonprofit that has a technology that is partnering with government agencies, broadcasters, content producers, and funders to curate digital content to homes and facilities through data casting. Okay, and so we'll hear more about that. Definitely on the kind of new, different side, and really looking forward to what you have to say and to offer. So without further ado, Jason, let's turn it over to you for your thoughts on this topic.
Thank you, Drew, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I'm looking forward to hearing from our panelists and looking forward to hearing from our viewers and taking on their questions. Appreciate that reminder back to that fateful day in March 2020 when school shut down. At the time, I had a kindergartner and a third grader, and we got a text message that schools were shutting down. It was a real shock. And I remember when my son, the kindergartner, came home, he brought a stack of about 2 weeks worth of worksheets. My daughter brought home her iPad. And then we kind of figured, okay, this is a temporary thing. Shortly thereafter, we realized it was going to be a longer term deal. And I think at that time, there was a real focus at all levels of government to really invest in broadband, from the federal government to local to state governments, and really build out our broadband infrastructure to make sure that, individuals and kids had access to the internet in their homes. A lot of school districts got creative. They put Wi-Fi on school buses and parked them in high needs communities. There's another district here in Virginia that built a what they call a wireless on wheels trailer. It was solar powered. And they would again go park it in high needs communities. I heard about a district in Alaska that actually used a local radio to broadcast instruction to the students in their district. So I would say if there is a silver lining through this whole pandemic, it really gave us the motivation to invest in broadband like we never had before. I think without the pandemic, we would not be where we are today in terms of broadband build out and the access that we have across the country. So continue our narrative, schools reopen fall 2020, some are virtual, some are in person, some are hybrid. And I think that broadband build out gave us flexibility with schools and teachers, to do flipped classrooms where a teacher might record a lesson at night and record a lesson, students watch it at night. And then there's more one-on-one time, some personalized learning that a teacher can do when students are back in their classroom. Snow days became remote learning days. Kids who were sick or maybe dealing with longer term illnesses didn't miss out on their learning. And I think we learned that some kids actually benefit more when they're learning online. For example, kids who have been bullied at school or maybe dealing with anxiety issues where they're learning much better at home. So obviously we have a lot of challenges that remain. Millions of kids even today still lack access to internet in their homes. And I think some kids who may have access might have to share a single device with parents and other siblings there when they're trying to get on the internet. The pandemic certainly exacerbated disparities. We're already seeing in education and access, opportunity, and achievement, where kids who are already facing big challenges, the pandemic fell harder on them than a lot of other kids and a lot of other school districts that could pivot more seamlessly. When my daughter came home with her iPad, I realized we were extremely lucky to live in a district that already had a one-to-one program for their students. I know so many districts out there did not. As test results start to roll in, we're seeing the impact on our students. The 2020 Nations Report Card found an 8-point decline in 8th grade math, a 5-point decline in 4th grade math. Those were the largest declines in history. In reading, 4th grade reading and 8th grade reading fell by 3 points. That was the largest decline we'd ever seen since 1992. These results aren't surprising, but they're no less worrisome. A lot of kids missed months or maybe even a year of learning during the pandemic because they didn't have broadband or because their parents had to go to work and they were at home watching their younger siblings, and certainly so many other challenges that we can't even imagine. I think the good news looking forward is we have this broadband build out that has given us a lot of flexibility for online, anytime, anywhere learning. Districts have responded. They have the data, they know where their challenges are, they're targeting resources and support to those areas. A lot of districts have expanded summer school learning. Others have expanded after school learning and other tutoring and support services to ensure that students can catch up and make up for that time where they lost learning. So I think looking forward, there are a lot of other opportunities that are exciting in the world of education. The promise of artificial learning is particularly exciting. I think there are opportunities there as well as a lot of challenges. I'm going to stop there. I think we're going to talk more about artificial learning later. So appreciate hearing again the opportunity and look forward to hearing from my other panelists and your questions. So thank you.
Great. Thank you for setting the stage there, Jason. Let's go right into Eileen. Tell us your perspectives on where we are on online learning.
I think it's a pretty exciting time. Having been a CTO on March 13th, 2020, when we used to be in the back room with the servers, and all of a sudden we were the most important department in the entire school district. We were definitely challenged to get Chromebooks and iPads out to students. We were absolutely challenged with access at home for our students. I also remember trying to teach my teachers how to use Google Meet for online learning during the pandemic, using Google Meet, and I'd be on the phone with them doing tech support because it was such a shift in how our students were learning. So we have come out of it pretty much. I think we've come out stronger and more aware of how our students learn and the access that they have at home. It definitely has has created opportunities for our students to have real-time interactions, personalized learning, access to resources, and to some extent equitable access. But I work very closely with COSIN. If all you know, it's a consortium of school networks, which is a national,
the coalition of what does it stand for? Coalition of
consortium for school networks, and it's a national.
We've had many. Sorry to interrupt. We've had many of them on programs.
Yep.
Keith Kruger
Yes.
of the organization has been on a guest on Broadband Breakfast Live Online before. So sorry. With that.
No. I worked on their home student connectivity study, which was very interesting. And I also worked with them on their new digital equity dashboard that they have coming out. But when I was a CTO, I worked in the Northern Berkshires, which was the last frontier of Massachusetts, and all the way to the Cape. And when we were handing out devices, and we realized it just wasn't a socioeconomic issue about broadband, it was geographical location in the community. We'd have one tower in the Valley of Williamstown, and we had families up in the hills who couldn't have access. So that has become a real passion of mine to make sure, and even on Cape Cod, which you think is a tourist community, the fiber didn't go out to the communities on either side of Route 6. So I think we're really still dealing with a digital divide around reliable broadband. I think we're also dealing with affordability, even though we are offering, $9.95 a month packages for families. We're finding they're not asking for it, or even $9.99 a month is a stretch for them. We're also realizing that broadband doesn't necessarily conducive to multifamily households where you have different families living in an apartment just because of either the dynamics of the family or just affordability. And we're also dealing with privacy and security. That's a huge area for me to talk about, because just having open broadband does not mean our students' data is not being collected and used in nefarious ways. I mean, I remember during the pandemic, kids were being told to go to McDonald's or go to Starbucks for their internet. And first of all, it's an open Wi-Fi, and It's not even close to being a conducive environment for our students to be learning. So,
yeah. Well, again, you've raised another set of issues that we need to be thinking and talking about here. Let's keep going through our speakers, because we've got two more, and then we'll have a great roundtable on it. So Charles, switching over to the higher education space, talk a little bit about your experience over the past 3.5 years in this topic area.
Well, first, Drew, thanks for having me. And by the way, thanks for all the broadband advocate efforts that you do. My house now has 5 gigabit fiber straight to the house, and I'm sure it's all because of you. So thank you personally for my fast internet that I now have. And as they put it in, it was like surprisingly easy. They just dug a few holes, and then the next thing you know, in my basement, there's a piece of fiber. And
great to hear. Thanks for that update there.
Do you want 2 meg or 5 meg? Like, I'm 2 gig or 5 gig. Sorry, not 2 gig or 5
not meg. We're beyond megs now.
Oh, yeah, 2 gig or 5 gig. So I got 2 gig. I couldn't figure out, like, what am I really going to do with 5 gig of fiber to my house? But so one of the things that I said I have a favorite saying that I probably said the first time I was on, and that is that a good teacher can teach on a beach with a pointed stick. And that is meaning that the part of teaching is to meet and learn from each challenge that you face. And when we were facing the shutdown, I'm like, bring it, right? I mean, this is a time for us to grow and a time for us to improve. And we did. The others on here talked about how fast things pivoted. We in higher education pivoted as well. And I was in great position because I'd already been doing kind of online stuff for a long time. And so it was really easy for me to pivot. But the one thing that I would observe, and I'm curious what the other panelists think about this, and it just felt to me like we were so student-centered and knew everybody was going through a really tough time, and that everyone was going through their own personal version of a very tough time. And so we were really sensitive and kind And the net result was, I think expectations were dropped, right? And what's difficult as we get back to face-to-face is it's difficult to convince students to go back to the previous expectations, because sometimes they graduated and got all new students that came in under what I'll call slightly lower expectations. And so just interestingly, as we face this need to kind of get back to the kind of expectations that we had before the pandemic, now we face ChatGPT. And I'm sure in third grade, they don't use ChatGPT too much, but in higher education, they use ChatGPT a lot. And so the combination of moving things online and allowing for remote whatever and changing assignments to make sure that they're remote, it tends to make some of your coursework ideally solvable by ChatGPT. And so we're now, the new problem to solve that is going to cause us to grow again is artificial intelligence and large language models. And so we as a faculty are looking at how not to prohibit them. I mean, we had a meeting back in May and nobody wanted to prohibit them. It's like, that's foolish. I mean, we really have to teach people to use them because they're going to be, that's like saying you need to do this job and you can't use Google search. And the answer is, well, so we're facing another sort of transformation, another sort of external forcing function that changes things. And I think it's a very exciting time. And I think that's the essence of teaching, is that everything changes. And the other thing that I would add very briefly is that I've done a lot on Coursera. I've been working on Coursera since 2013. And one of the things I've done, sort of started about 4 years ago, is realizing that we are never going to, we can't just say, here's some online education, here's a course or two as a grown-up or as a person who can't go to college, and just take our course and figure it out. What I've realized is we as providers of online education broadly to adults have got to think about what it takes to create an educational experience that leads all the way to a job. And for me, it's a job in programming. And so I've been doing a lot of work to try to create not just a course, but a whole curriculum that a person can take anywhere on the planet, regardless of economic capabilities, regardless of technology they have in their hands, that I can somehow, if they're patient enough and they work long enough, they can go through this curriculum and be employed. And so I think that the expectations for online education, we need to push them up, right? And so we can't just say, oh, ChatGPT is hard. Oh, the pandemic was hard. The answer is no, we got to really push. And a school like the University of Michigan thinks that way. We think like, how can we educate poor people in India using all the riches that we have? So, and I'll stop there and look forward to the rest of the panel.
Truly a medley of interests and approaches. You can see so much fits under this bucket of online education and learning, and it's going to get expanded more here. So turn it over to you, Eric. Tell us a little bit about what you're doing and your tie into this space before we have a freewheeling conversation on this.
You bet. And thanks for including me on this panel. It's kind of amazing group of panelists that I'm on with. So Information Equity Initiative, we're an international nonprofit organization. We were originally established by PBS member stations here in the United States during COVID. And it was really out of recognition that about 25% of US households do not have high-speed internet, either because of affordability or because of their geographic location. But PBS television spectrum reaches about 97% of US households, and about 82% of the world's countries have a digital television standard. So we're interoperable with about 90% of the world's population. So what we've done is we've built a platform up in AWS that allows a curator, a second grade teacher, a public health officer, an administrator at an incarceration facility, an emergency manager, to select curated digital content, either through their own laptop. We've got a globally available cloud archive of content. We're partnered with Sesame Street and several other major content producers. And they select the content that's most appropriate for their students. It travels through our cloud to a broadcast station where it then goes out over 1 million watts of power. So for a moment in time, a second grade teacher takes charge of 1 million watts of power. And then any home or facility that exists within that broadcast footprint will receive that curated content. This can be PDFs, ebooks, videos, audio files, so that we're not talking about television channels here. We're talking about digital content. It will arrive at the home on a little, we used to call it an education device, but after we partnered with Sesame Street, they said it would be a lot cuter to call it an Eddy. So now our little Eddy receives the content. It has its own storage and creates a Wi-Fi hotspot. So any mobile phone, tablet, or laptop can then connect, gain access to the web server. There's no need for internet. There's no need for a mobile plan, and they'll have access to all of those lesson plans, ebooks, videos, whatever the case may be, in their home. What's been interesting for us, and it's interesting because the head of education at Sesame had said early on that if you can't reach, you can't teach. And so this is by no means us advocating that folks shouldn't have high-speed internet. We hope everyone gets that, but it's really recognition that it's a long ways out, especially across the global South, but even here in the US. But what's been so amazing to us is the rapid proliferation of use cases. We're now in multiple prisons, working with departments of corrections in 5 different states. They love it because it's one way and therefore highly secure. So we're working on therapeutic, educational, and workforce content across incarceration. We're in over 150 federally qualified health centers with touchscreen kiosks in waiting rooms, multiple languages, and all locally curated. We very intentionally take a non-colonial view about content. So all content decisions are always pushed down to the local level. We're working in early childhood centers. K-12 obviously has been the initial focus. In Rio de Janeiro, we're starting to work to connect schools themselves. There's 26,000 schools in Brazil that don't have internet, 5,000 of which have no electricity. I was just on the phone this morning with the Zambian government, who needs quite a bit of help right now with some connectivity. So we're seeing tremendous demand on how can someone who's trusted like an educator get content to a kid or a school that needs it. So very happy to be on this panel and look forward to any questions.
Well, wonderful. And again, there's so much to be said, and I'm inviting our participants from this platform, Zoom, which restreams through other platforms. And we actually have a question from one of our other platforms, great, on YouTube. Casey Baylor is asking Jason, what can local governments do more to promote the construction of broadband infrastructure in their communities? And that's actually probably good for others too. But since the question was asked of you, Jason, talk a little bit about the specifics of broadband infrastructure build out and how that ties into the work of the National Association of School Boards.
Yeah, so it's a tremendous question. It's a tremendous issue in a lot of communities around the country. I would say, school board members are community members. They're elected, but most of them are volunteered, unpaid positions. They shop in the grocery stores. They often have kids in the district, and I would say that they're a great resource for community members who are in need of broadband. And I would say demonstrate the need is tremendous. You look at government surveys and they do kind of the best they can with the data they have. I think that they overstate the broadband availability in a lot of communities. I think Eileen made the point that some families often share, an access device, maybe a cell phone for 5 or 6 people in the family, and that's considered, connected. So I think demonstrating demand is really important. There's, programs out there at the government level, the affordability connectivity program. The FCC announced on Monday that I think 14 million people have signed up for that. It provides a $30 a month discount for low-income families. That's great that it's serving so many people. The downside is the more people it serves, the faster it's going to run out of money. So projections indicate that it might run out as early as first quarter of next year. So I think we have huge challenges there in terms of both access and affordability on broadband, as we've said. Evidently, there's talk that the Biden administration may be pushing forward a supplemental funding bill that could provide some more money for broadband and childcare. I guess we'll have to see where that ends up. But as far as the local to this questioner is really demonstrate the demand, work with your school board, work with your local government officials. There is some federal money out there, but the demand is much higher than the funding that exists. So it's a real competition. But I would say, that's the first step I would take.
And I would add that affordable connectivity program is obviously something we've focused a lot on. We've had sessions on, we had one in June on that. And we're going to have another one next month, September, on that specific program. And you've laid it out nicely, Jason. It's giving $30 a month, 70 in tribal areas, or 75 in tribal areas. And that $30 a month subsidy will go away when that money is spent, unless there's some renewal or reconfiguration of funding. In the Zoom questions, Charles has said he's got 100 questions for Eric. And so let's actually turn over to you, Charles. Go ahead and ask a couple questions, because let's hear kind of what a person in the education space is thinking about this kind of newish, or at least technology that seems to have gotten a new lease of life because of COVID.
Well, so my first question, Eric, is while you were talking, I kept thinking I got the date wrong, that this was really the 2033 meeting that we were at, because it felt like you were from the future. The words you were saying as you said them felt to me like this is the dream. I have met many people in education and educational technology that have described exactly this dream and made nonprofits and affected a couple of schools and did these things and created a widget and did this stuff. And you seem to have reached escape velocity on it. None of the other ones I've ever heard of really reached escape velocity. They would do a great demonstration and then funding would run out. And so I'm glad you're talking about this. I was looking away from the screen because I've been scanning your website since you stopped talking. But the biggest question is like, how far is this? Can I just order an Eddy? Can I put my course on Eddy? And I'll stop there.
Yeah, well, the quick answer is it depends. And what it depends on is, do we have throughput with a television station in your market, right? So ultimately we're right now in 5 US states, a territory, and we're designing out in Brazil right now, and I'm working with the UN on a couple of deployments internationally. But you have to live within the contour of a broadcaster that is working with us. And all that really means is we drop a server at their station, it connects to our AWS environment, and then the content can all then be encoded and sent out. But it also then requires that we manage a database. We don't collect any information. Obviously, we just need to be able to correlate a user with the device number. And so that database, we usually work with a school district, or obviously within incarceration in that environment, or within public health. We're working with a major NGO to work on health issues for women during and following pregnancy to improve health outcomes. The insurers will actually handle the distribution in that case. And so we're not yet in Walmart, right? Although Sesame has talked about wanting to put Big Bird or a furry googly eye thing on our Eddy at some point, but we're not at that stage yet. But we're only a year and a half old, so we're quite a new nonprofit, but the demand we're seeing is quite significant. And I'll post a little 2-minute explainer video in the chat.
And we'll put that on the page for this event, so people watching other platforms. 2 quick questions on this. How many people are currently using this technology? And 2, how do you get the answers up, right? I mean, you described it as a one-way technology. Is there some mechanism for data and communications back upstream?
Yeah, so on the second question, we do have an edge device that has a SIM card, so we can put LTE into the Eddy to create WhisperNet for a modest return path. But in most cases, the homes have a mobile plan or DSL, so they can send a text message with a question or answers back to a teacher.
Our world now relies on their
to a public health officer. Right now in Africa, we're looking at a satellite return path. So if you think about your relationship with Netflix, 99.99% of the bits are flowing down. So it's pretty modest in terms of what we need return for. You'll never use our system to like buy tennis shoes, right? It's very much the only content that comes down is that which is curated by someone who's trusted and authorized in the platform. And then the return can either be an outside mechanism like text or dial-up internet, or simply taking the device back to a school where there is Wi-Fi, where they can then send answers and so forth. To answer your question, we have pilots now stood up in 5 states. We're planning rollouts in another 6 states right now, some in the 5 and one in the 6-figure amount in terms of number of homes. In Brazil, it's really quite modest. We're starting with just 6 schools, but that potentially could grow to 26,000 schools. So we're still quite early stages in terms of sheer numbers. The bigger the facilities like incarceration or public health facilities can see one incarceration facility will have 5,500 concurrent users. And in that case, we use an Edward, which is the adult version of the Yeti. It's just a bigger server. In Brazil, they call it the Eduardo. So but it's the same setup.
Any other quick questions, Charles?
No, I don't have any more quick questions. I have
Okay.
hundreds of
Well,
questions.
let's stick for a minute or two on infrastructure. Eileen has pointed out that we are also seeing school districts build their own LTE towers to their communities. Do you want to say a word or two on kind of the infrastructure and the role of schools and school boards on this aspect?
Yeah, I mean, it's, especially during the pandemic, we became the main source for Wi-Fi for our students. And we realized it was more of a community issue than it was just a school issue. There were families looking to, apply for jobs, pay bills, things like that. So a lot of districts are working with companies like Khajiit, and they're working with their local businesses, and they're working with their towns and counties to actually build out LTE towers that actually, they may be in Santa Fe, and there's, with hundreds of square miles of school district. And by building these LTE towers, they're able to get to those students and those families, not only for their educational purposes, but also their livelihood, or just to connect to a doctor. And so it has become a community problem. And we can't rely on the service providers for it anymore. We're realizing in education, we need to find solutions that work for everybody.
Well, and again, just to sort of encourage those of you who may be coming into this discussion for the education piece of it, this is really a core of what we cover and have been writing about, and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and the program, the largest program. Obviously, affordable connectivity is one that's funded by IIJA, but the BEAD program, broadband equity access and deployment, that is kind of right in the middle. We're just getting started on states doing the rollout. So these are huge programs, and it is completely obvious that we would not have gotten IIJA and BEAD without the pandemic. That the pandemic prompted the realization that the quality of broadband we had was not sufficient to do the kinds of things, including education, that are so important, right? And so any other thoughts on kind of the spur that the pandemic has had before we kind of move into, I'd like to talk quite a bit about the social dimension of education, particularly in the K-12 environment, but any other thoughts on infrastructure from Charles or Jason that you want to add to this discussion? All right, let's talk about schooling. And in particular, I want to talk about the role of teachers and administrators in the K-12 context, and also sort of the role of students and even the social environment. And there's a lot that could be said on this. Let's actually start with Doreen Cornwall's question. I know one real big pain point for parents who use accessibility tools has been inaccessibility of the electronic instructional systems. How can people buying such systems learn how to include accessibility in their product requirements? Any thoughts on this? By accessibility, Doreen, I'm assuming you're meaning, hard of hearing and visually impaired.
Yeah, specific range of accessibility features, but definitely blind, low vision, hearing impaired, but there's also some dexterity things where just having a full set of accessibility concepts built in is a way of not leaving behind people who are, parents who are raising kids or kids who grow up using some of these products. So I just want to put that out there, ask if anybody has had any experience about it or wants anything to share. Because I just know it's been a pain point for people I talk to.
Yeah.
Great. Well, let's get the reaction here from other panelists.
I have some thoughts on it, if it's okay.
Yes.
This became apparent to us during the pandemic as well, is because we had, our second, our first, our native speakers, and then we had students with disabilities. We had families with disabilities. We used to have these Zoom faculty meetings where we had deaf teachers who we had to bring in a sign person to actually interpret what was going on in the meeting. We as leaders in the ed tech world are really asking our vendors and solution providers to really start thinking about how to make sure those tools of accessibility are built within their products and not just an add-on. I shouldn't need an interpreter to come in to a community meeting to be able to interpret for our multi-language families on what's going on. So I think we as tech leaders are really holding solution providers to the fires on this topic. So
great. Let me build on that question in another capacity here. Thank you, Doreen, for being with us and for raising your question. And Eileen, let me again ask you too. What are some of the issues that we learned that we maybe didn't know before about the technologies? What did you think would happen in a fully online environment, K-12, right? And then once we actually had that in 2020, what did we learn that we didn't know, like problems with the technology and the solutions from a point of view of the deliverers of instruction, the educators, the administrators, and so forth?
I think just education on how to use the technology. I mean, we sent all these students home with devices. We sent teachers home with devices and said, now you're going to use a learning management system, and now you're going to have a Google Classroom, and the big thing is we didn't have broadband, we didn't have Wi-Fi, we didn't have parents at home who were either educated in technology or were even available. When they have 5 students at home, all in online learning environments, how do we support those students at home? We also had privacy issues around videos. We're sharing videos, we're sharing voices, we're seeing what home life is like, which was an interesting fact that we realized that there are some of our students who are living in situations that are harmful to them in some respects. So I think the education was a big piece, and during that whole time, I would be on the phone, and I'm sure that Jason was on the phone too with parents saying, I need help on how to actually log into a Zoom meeting.
Help was needed. Jason, please give us your thoughts. Delve into this topic a bit.
Yeah, I mean, Eileen knows it much better than I do. I remember my own experience. The person who was the busiest at our school when we went remote was the technology person who was, how do I connect to this? How do I get that? What password do I use? What do I do here? What do I do there? And I think that the benefit is, our teachers, I appreciate Charles's point about a teacher can teach on a beach with a stick. But, there was a lot of learning that needed to be done there. In many cases, a lot of veteran teachers had been teaching, very similar lessons because they know what works for years and years and years. And, you can't just put it on a computer, it's not a snap of a finger. So there was a lot of learning that had to be done there from teachers and administrators and parents during that time. And I think that was a real benefit that we've gotten through it. And now we have that experience and we know how to do that, because I think we're going to need it, because I think the next challenge on the horizon is artificial intelligence. And, like Charles said, in higher ed, it's very prevalent already. I think in a lot of K-12 schools, it is as well. I think the first reaction in the K-12 world is, kind of like what Charles said, is to ban it. And I think that's the wrong approach, because when cell phones and laptops first started coming into classrooms and iPads, the first response was, put it in your desk, give it to the teacher, turn it off, do whatever. And then through time, we got to see them as really valuable learning tools. And I think when we think about artificial intelligence, there are opportunities and challenges there. There need to be policies in place on what is permissible, what is not. I think this younger generation of kids, having grown up online, as digital natives, have learned a lot about plagiarism. You can't just copy from a website, put it into a paper. I think artificial intelligence allows them to disguise that a little bit better. So I think there's a lot of instruction that needs to be done there, especially with kids when they're younger, to learn what's right and what's not. Obviously, there are big privacy issues, security issues, as Eileen knows, I'm sure, and then certainly teacher training around how to use artificial intelligence in instruction in your classroom. But again, we've been there with cell phones and iPads, and artificial intelligence is just another challenge, but also an opportunity as I see it.
Let me invite Jason, Eileen, Charles, also Eric, if you've got any, is like, what did we learn that we now know? Like, so in other words, what were some of the things that we struggled with on the balance of where the education takes place, the role of all these collaborative tools, Eileen, that you talked about? Like, if another pandemic came down, next year or whenever, right, and we have to go back to this kind of thing, what are we going to do differently than we did in 2020?
I think getting kids away from the screen for seven, 8 hours a day.
Yeah. And why? Talk about that issue. Why is that?
I think screen time is not good for students. I think it lends itself to bullying, inappropriate conduct. I also think that students don't learn well when they're looking at a screen. I think they need more personalized, off-screen, tech-free projects to work on. So if I used to be a high school math teacher in my prior careers, but I would actually have them start doing more research instead of listening to a teacher online, filling out an online workshop, really looking at real world problems to have them do. So, but definitely get them off the screen for 8 hours a day.
This is a great point. I'm glad you raised it, because maybe it gets to the heart of like what we have learned and what we haven't. Charles, I'm fascinated by what you will say to Eileen's point about less screen time.
Well, I'll just say that's a tough one. I think that we can't completely eliminate screen time, but what I would say is what I'd like to see eliminated is the fact that this student has to sit at the kitchen table for 8 hours a day. And so if we're going to use technology to educate them, that technology can be with them in a park, that technology can be with them when they're taking a walk. And I look at, as also an education technology provider, I look at this as the current set of solutions, whether it's Classroom or Canvas or Desire to Learn or Arium, they all kind of have cloned one another, and they're all, to me, a disaster. They're all completely terrible, including the one I'm involved in, which is Sakai. As a teacher, as a software developer, I love my software, but as a teacher, I despise this form that we call the learning management system. And I think that if we had if we are going to prepare for another pandemic, I think we need a completely different way to capture and share and get material into the students' hands in a way that's right time, right place, not just sit at the kitchen table, chained into a chair for 8 hours while they're clicking next on a learning management system, which is technology literally that hasn't hardly changed since 1997. And so, I have a son, he's in his 30s. young people are crazy. I have to text him to tell him to read email. And we have all these systems that think that email is the lingua franca of the universe. And the answer is we are not going, just these systems that are so old, don't go where the student's at and don't go with the students where they go. And so the answer is not necessarily get rid of all technology, but I think we've got to come up with a technology that can be right place, right time, right amount.
Let's hear from Jason and Eric on this point, because I really appreciate your fingering this screen time question.
One of the interesting things that we've been hearing were in the pandemic, when these Wi-Fi hotspots were distributed by some of the mobile carriers through government subsidy, there was a defined amount of data that were permissible on a monthly basis. And oftentimes all of the data was used within the first 2 or 3 days because they were streaming high def movies. And so for the next 27 days, there was no data left for the kid to learn. And so that's been what we're hearing on our side, because everything we do is obviously asynchronous through a different pipe, and it's free for the family. But it's only content that's curated for the appropriate use case. So I don't know how that changes in the future, when hopefully it doesn't happen, but when there is another pandemic. But it has been kind of an interesting anecdote.
Well, Eric, I'm just going to quickly piggyback on that. Is when we were giving out Wi-Fi devices, they were for consumer use. They weren't for educational use. And you know, companies like Kajit and those kind of companies, you know, pivoted, and they were already educational only Wi-Fi hotspots. So we were able to filter and block and make sure that they were only being used for instructional use. But everybody was handing out a hotspot, and they weren't for educational purposes during that time.
Yeah, and I'll add, you know, it's a huge challenge, you know, as a parent of a now third grader who has his iPad, and they block, you know, certain websites in our community, but companies are really creative. There's this one site he used that has an academic name in the website, but it's all just video games. So I think Eileen makes a great point about screen time. I'd also like to make a difference between passive and active and individual versus group. I completely agree that just sitting and watching a video hours upon hours upon hours, or even listening to a lecture, you know, for that long is not a great way for kids to learn, you know, 8 hours a day. However, if you can get, you know, some active participation, you know, remotely, you know, in groups. My daughter, who's a middle school student, you know, did this project for her school remotely, where she was collaborating with 3 or 4 of her friends in the evening, you know, on this project that they had. And it was just great seeing them kind of bounce ideas off each other and work on their projects. And then they'd talk, and then they'd go work, and then they'd come back and talk about what they had done. So I just think there are just tremendous opportunities there. But yeah, absolutely. Big concerns around, you know, the overall amount of time they're spending, because also as soon as they hop off their educational devices, you know, they want to go play video games, or they want to get on YouTube, or they want to do whatever. So, you know, we won't even talk about their attention spans and how short they are, but certainly, you know, continuing challenges there going forward.
Yeah. We have another question here. Let's see if we can get it in. Sarah Cheeverton asks, question for Charles and others. Do you think that online learning is as much a threat to higher ed's campus real estate model, business model, as administrators think? How do we get administrators to let go of the more buildings is better mentality? And she analogizes it to the, you know, return to office push. The whole kind of dynamic commercial real estate has really kind of changed because people are reevaluating, do I really need to do a sort of 5-day-a-week workplace? And the answer for the most part is no, I don't. But how does that translate into higher education? So for you, Charles.
Sarah, thanks for the question. It's a great question. I saw it in the chat, and I was already writing notes, hoping I get a chance to answer it. You know, I don't know if my bosses are going to watch this or not. Let's perhaps hope not. The biggest mistake in the return to office push is that they're treating all classes the same. And there are some classes that are taught that are just kind of skill classes that might as well just be online. And then there's other and they even could be taken asynchronously, not even on a semester by semester boundary. And then there's other classes that are just so fun to do in person and so rich to do in person. And so I think the problem is that there's this sort of conceit that says if a class isn't in a room, it's a second class citizen, right? And so what I wish we could do is just accept that we teach different kinds of classes. On education is a wide portfolio of classes of different kinds. And if we could acknowledge that some of those classes, not all those classes, need closer interaction, and then be efficient with the student's time, be efficient with the teacher's time, and be efficient with the real estate, and use those co-located spaces for the things that they should be used for. But it's at least at my university, it's hard to get past this notion that we should all just go back into big rooms the way we always were. So I think that's something we got to figure out.
How does this thinking apply to the K-12 environment, Eileen and Jason and Eric? I mean, because I think there's a lot of wisdom in this, and the notion of less screen time, change the structure, some things in person, but really prioritize. But what do you think about how the in person? I mean, if we had to kind of have three things: must be in person, can be synchronous online, and asynchronous online. Like how do we think about those three venues, if you will, for K-12 education, Eileen, Jason, and Eric?
I can start. All right, so the first thing is in person, social interaction, key. That has to happen. And what was the second one? Sorry.
Synchronous online. So things that are screen time based, so to speak, because you got to be sitting and watching like this. This is a synchronous online interaction that we're having through.
Right. I think small group collaboration, perfect for this. And things, what's the third? Things that have to be
asynchronous, right? How do we do asynchronous learning for kids, for K-12 situations before they really have developed the college level skills?
All right, so I think social interaction is the first one, in person. Synchronous is group work. I think, and also teacher support and tutoring. And the third one, I would say, for real life projects and applications, research, those kind of things.
Yeah. What do you think, Jason, about the way we think about K-12 in the new world?
Yeah, and thinking about the question about higher ed real estate, and the return to office, people voted with their feet, right? People said, I'm not going to go back to the office 5 days a week. I think if we see a new generation of students or whatever say, I don't want to go to a big university, I don't want to be away from home, I want to learn in my room, then you're going to see some changes, whether they want to make them or not. And I think it's going to be really interesting when you see this generation who's gone through this pandemic and has really learned online at a very young age, more than any other generation, what it will be like when they hit high school, when they start looking at college. Is it going to be different? Are they going to prefer online options where they could stay at home, maybe care for a relative or be close to family? I don't know. It's going to be fascinating to watch. The other thing I'd say, as far as remote, in person or virtual, interaction is great, certainly, and kids need to be around other kids. Learn that social connection, learn how to act socially. We heard reports of a lot of kids who were online for 2 years, got back into school and kind of forgot how to be part of a group and act respectfully. At the same time, I think it provides opportunities we may not have thought about before. Where I live, some high school kids are taking PE virtually over the summer to free up a course when they go back in person for an elective or a language or something like that. And it may sound silly, but they have these virtual PE courses where they go out and they ride a bike, or they go out and they do this and they keep track of the things that they've done. And again, it frees them up for an elective where they need an instructor there to really teach them and provide that personalized learning they need for, an elective or a language or an advanced math or some other opportunity.
Let's give everyone 30 seconds to close out, and we'll go in the reverse order that we started. So Eric, Charles, Eileen, and Jason.
Yeah, so we kind of approach it from a slightly different perspective and one of equity. So as classrooms become flipped and students are getting materials to read or watch to be prepared for class, the kids that don't have internet are not gaining access to that material, or mom has to drive Johnny to a McDonald's parking lot to gain access to Wi-Fi. So here in the US, we're really thinking of it not as a full-time sit in front of the computer during the day to learn, but it's to gain access to the material so that they're prepared for class. Whereas across the global South, it's a totally different situation where kids are using 15-year-old used textbooks that are probably dated from a pedagogical perspective. So how can we inexpensively pair our Eddie with a projector so that every kid in the class, and these are kids that don't have laptops, tablets, or mobile phones, can gain access to updated, pedagogically sound content. So I think instead of framing it as, is it 8 hours a day at a kitchen table, there is still an access to information aspect here that's important, both in a classroom setting, in places that don't have internet, or in a home that has the same challenge.
Thank you, Eric. Charles.
So having seen this all happen for 3 years and see that there's just always something new coming, right? And we always have to react. This is no time to rest. It's never been a time to rest. I fear that education providers and educational technology providers who are multi-billion-dollar companies are like, they think that the fact that they're billion-dollar companies means that they're right, and that there is no further need for innovation. And we're not ready for the next pandemic. And unless we really commit to innovation, we're not going to be ready for that next pandemic, or the next ChatGPT, or the next whatever it is that needs to happen. And so, it's a joy to be near the front of this. It's also frustrating because the event horizon just keeps moving. No matter how hard we work, we got to keep on working.
Eileen, final thoughts.
I think we need to prepare our students for the fourth industrial revolution, for jobs that have not even been created yet. So I think, but I think school districts need to find ways to strike a balance between the benefits and challenges. It's always going to play a pivotal role. Technology is not going away, but we want to make sure we have innovative teaching methods, personalized learning experiences, and improve collaboration. But for me as a former CTO, we also want to address the digital inequities. Online safety is really critical, and making sure we have a holistic approach using technology, that we're making sure that we're supporting our students' physical and emotional well-being as well.
Great. Thank you. Jason, final quick thoughts.
Yeah, I just want to double down on what Eric and Eileen just said. Eric, on the equity component, not only in terms of access, but it is just also in terms of time. Kids live such different situations in their home life. Eileen referred to, when they went remote, we saw some of the situations where kids were living. I just hope that we continue to think about those challenges that these kids are facing that we can't even imagine, and try to provide the support and resources that they need. And to Eileen's point about mental health and exposure to trauma, and we see the test scores that say their math scores are down, their reading scores are down. We can't see what they lived through during the pandemic, whether they lost loved ones, whether they had parents lose their jobs, how that impacted their education. I think that's just a tremendous issue for us going forward. And I know it's a big focus for school boards around the country.
Well, it's been great. We hope we haven't gone too long over. Before we thank our guests, I want to remind you, we'll be back next week, Wednesday at 12 noon from Florida Fiber Connect. On behalf of our panelists, Jason, Eileen, Charles, and Eric, I'm Drew with Broadband Breakfast. We'll see you next week. Take care, everyone.